Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. If you could come in and be quiet. My name's Peter Moore. I have the honour of chairing this first session and introducing you to this panel. I must say it's lovely to be back. It's lovely to be back in person, and it's lovely to be back in person here in Porto. And I'm sure all of us would like to echo the sentiments of the first session, where there was thanks for the organisers, for the country of Portugal, and the people who've put this fantastic conference together. So it's fantastic to be here. I'm Australian, and in my country, for the past few years, we've developed the habit of recognition of country. And that is that we recognise the Indigenous owners and elders of the lands that we live on. And so I would like to recognise the elders, past, present and emerging, of all the Indigenous peoples in all of our countries as we start this session. A couple of housekeeping things. The young people among you might not know this. This is called a piece of paper. And if you put a lot of them together, you get something like this, and this is called a book. But of course, what we do have is everybody has a device. You might not have a piece of paper, and you might not have a book, but you've all got a device. And on the device, as you've been told a number of times, there's an app. Now, an app is not an all-purpose plaything. An app is short for an application. And if you have the application, during this session and at any time, you can pose a question. The questions will come up on an iPad here, and so you can, as we work through the presentations and the discussions, you can pose a question, it'll come up, and it'll be moderated, and we will pose the question to our panellists. There will also be, in the question time, 3 microphones that will be moving around. What we're here today, as Tiago indicated, was to start on the first day to look at the problem. And we know that tomorrow it's talking all about integrated fire management. That's a term that was first used in the early 80s, 81, 82, 83, and then characterised. Ron Myers wrote a paper on it, a book that you can still get from the Nature Conservancy that sets out integrated fire management, and that was fantastic. Tiago mentioned the voluntary fire management guidelines that were developed, and they're another group of principles and ideas that were very good. Many of you have heard of the 2 Ps and 2 Rs, or the 5 Rs, review and analyse, reduce the risk based on the review and analysis, get ready to fight fires, respond to fires, and then recover. And in the recovery process, review and analyse again to understand the problem. So what we're here today to do is to open up that discussion. We've got 90 minutes to discuss it, to think about it, to reflect on what we know or what we would like to know. And we have a great group of people here to talk about. As I said, my name's Peter Moore. I'm Australian. I've worked in a number of countries around the world and for the FAO. And I think in a cheeky way, the organisers have asked me to be the first speaker because I'm part of the problem. Now, it's not the suit. The suit's Italian, the suit's fine. It's what's in the suit. And what's in the suit is a male who's Caucasian and speaks only English. And that's part of the problem. If you think about the documentation, the materials, the history of fire management, there's an awful amount of it that takes place in English and not internationally. So one of the things is that we've got to break part of that problem, and I know there's a session later in this conference on that. Allow me to introduce our panellists. Many of you will know Stephen Pine. He's the Emeritus Professor at Arizona State University. He's been writing to us and for us for many years about the history of fire in various continents, and he'll talk to us, make a keynote presentation today. Alexander Quintanilha is next to him. Alexander is a Member of Parliament here in Portugal with a long and distinguished history of research, and he's also the chair, or the president I think it's called here, of the Committee on Science and Education. Alexander was the person tasked with bringing the climate change legislation for Portugal into being, so he's got a lot of experience about bringing people around a complicated environment. Harufidi Rako Ratsimba is a researcher and head of a centre in Madagascar, and he'll be talking to us and responding to questions. For this session, in a minute, we have a video from Susan Gardner. Susan is a director from the United Nations Environment Programme. She wasn't able to be here today, but she's put a video together. You will probably all remember the wildfires report that UNEP Grid Arundel did and released early last year. So if I can ask our technicians for... Thank you.
Across the globe, we know that wildfires are growing in frequency, intensity, and wreaking havoc on human life, on health, environment, wildlife, and infrastructures alike. And this is truly a stark warning, reinforced by the recent IPCC report on climate impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. The science is truly clear. Already last year, UNEP and Grid Arundel had a report on spreading like wildfire, the rising threat of extraordinary landscape fires, highlighting that climate change and land use change are projected to make wildfires more frequent and more intense. Global increases of extreme fires of up to 14% just by 2030, with 30% by the end of 2050 and 50% increases by the end of this century. So you can see wildfires and climate change are mutually exacerbating. And that's before we even mention the appalling and devastating loss and damage. The loss of life, the loss of livelihoods, loss of agricultural areas during a time when we're already facing severe rising food costs and insecurity, and the irreversible damages to ecosystems and the services that they provide to all of us. Wildfires also disproportionately affect the world's poorest nations. And this is in an area where oftentimes the capacity is the lowest to be able to respond, and so flames can continue for days, weeks, even months. And it impedes the progress towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and even further contributes to deepening social inequities. It is, however, encouraging to be able to witness the launch of the Landscape Fires Governance Networks as a key outcome of this conference, an initiative that will be critical to stepping up integrated fire management best practices. To be successful, we really do need to radically change how we are investing public spending on wildfires. Governments are encouraged to adopt a new fire-ready formula that minimizes the risks of these extreme wildfires just by being better prepared. And there's a few areas where we can do more. First, investing a lot more in fire risk reduction, integrated fire management, and early warning systems instead of primarily on reactive management. The second is by deepening ties and working together with local communities, as well as incorporating indigenous and local knowledge into landscape adaptation and fire prevention. Third, investing in mitigation and adaptation measures as two sides of the same coin. The actions on global commitments now to fight climate change are essential. Emissions must peak as soon as possible and no later than 2025, or we're going to find ourselves in an ever-burning planet. Finally, what we can do is to be recognizing the crucial role of high-quality ecosystem restoration, such as forest landscape restoration and re-wetting wetlands or peatlands, is really important in terms of minimizing the risk of wildfires. All of this does require effective cooperation and a joint approach across all sectors that are affected by wildfires. Look, we know that climate change is a critical part of the equation, and at COP28 in Dubai, member states have to raise ambitions, driving action to reduce greenhouse gases in an unprecedented level over just the next 7 years. In doing so, we can avert and minimize the most devastating consequences of climate change, such as those caused by wildfires. And we also have another global roadmap. It's set out in the newly agreed Global Biodiversity Framework. Implementing the biodiversity framework will slow down land cover change and also help drastically in preventing future wildfires. When the world is burning, we have no choice but all to become firefighters, and UNEP stands ready to help member states. We'll continue to provide the science, the tools, the assessments, the information that you need to guide evidence-based policies, and convening member states to strengthen countries' capacities to invest and implement an integrated fire management. We're so pleased to have joined FAO to set up the Global Fire Management Hub that aims to strengthen capacities to implement an integrated fire management approach and reduce the negative impacts of wildfires on livelihoods, landscapes, and global climate. This is a key mechanism to implement and monitor the newly launched Landscape Fire Governance Framework. And we look forward to collaborating with all of you to bring together this much needed global fire initiative agendas. Thank you.
So thank you in her absence to Dr. Gardner. Perhaps, Stephen, if I can ask you to come to the podium and make your keynote presentation, please.
Well, good morning, and my thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to address such an extraordinary gathering of fire folk and to speak about a topic of much interest to me, our deepening fire age. I think everyone in this room realizes that the Earth is a unique fire planet. Fire has been a part of terrestrial ecosystems for over 400 million years. As soon as plants colonized continents, they began to burn, and they've been burning ever since. But we are also a uniquely fire creature and have become the keystone species for fire on the planet. We got big heads and small guts because we learned to cook food. We went to the top of the food chain because we learned to cook landscapes. And now we've become a global force because we've begun to cook the planet. This process of what I think is the beginning of the Pyrocene launches at the end of the last glaciation when a fire-wielding creature encounters an increasingly fire-receptive world. They make a mutual assistance pact. Each will expand the domain of the other. So we will take fire to times and places it could not have existed on its own, and fire will take us to places that we could not have found without it. We even leave the planet on plumes of flame. Europe has had an interesting and in some ways special role in all this. Like other places, people in fire have interacted to shape the landscape, but especially within an agricultural matrix. A built landscape, but one in which fire will operate as a catalyst. In fact, this recognition is quite ancient. Here's Cicero talking about how humans, by the application of their mind and hand, have remade raw first nature into a second nature. And the fire that they did this with, we might regard as a second fire, a kind of domesticated or tamed version of nature's raw fire. And wildfires occurred when that social order broke down. Europe was also responsible for globalizing fire. Beginning in the 15th century by our Portuguese hosts, we commonly think of this in political or maybe economic terms, but it was also an ecological process, an exchange of plants, an exchange of animals, and an exchange of people, particularly after the extraordinary collapse of populations in the Americas. Here we can see the record for Mexico, 90% lost within less than a century. This created vacuums, changed the entire character of fire over a very large part of the planet. And indeed, recent research is suggesting ways in which this had affected even the climate, perhaps as a contributing cause to the Little Ice Age. Well, this has gone beyond status as a historical coincidence, is now, I think, a legitimate correlation, and future research will decide whether it is a cause as well. But all this happened within what we might call living landscapes, this terrestrial world that had co-evolved with fire, which came with internal checks and balances to fire use. Flexible, but could be broken. Europe then begins in the late 18th century a second wave of expansion, this time from more northern Europe, and that coincides with the scientific revolution, especially the discovery of oxygen, which changes how European intellectuals think about fire. Instead of being a broad integrative presence on the landscape, it has been reduced to a process of physical chemistry. It coincided with a technological revolution that, building on that same new understanding of fire, began to create fire engines, that is, steam engines that would in turn require boundless amounts of fossil fuels to run them. And this changed how fire could be applied to restructure the ways people lived on Earth. And all these together with this expansion disseminated Western concepts and institutions throughout large regions of the globe. And instead of living landscapes, we begin seeing a transition, a new dependence for power on what I call lithic landscapes, that is, once living, now fossilized worlds that we are exhuming and burning. And this fundamentally changes the ecology of combustion because it no longer has boundaries. You can burn day and night, winter and summer, wet or dry. The amount of fuel is essentially unbounded, so there is lots of energy to be produced, but there is no place ecologically to absorb all of the effluents, which then become massive pollutants of the air, water, and even of land. And if you combine that with all the other things we get out of fossil biomass, just look at the composition of the room here, from plastics and petrochemicals and everything else, we might begin thinking about a third nature, where the past has been interwoven with the present and lofted into the future. So all this reorganizes the geography of fire. We've changed. We've removed fire out of our domestic settings and most of our modern cities, just as we have in this room. We've applied a similar transition to agriculture. The Green Revolution is really premised on access to fossil biomass for fuel, to power machines, but also the petrochemicals that it requires. And in the process allows us to change the agricultural landscape by eliminating fallow. But fallow was where most of the biodiversity of these agricultural landscapes resided. And then we've tried to extend this same process of transformation to the countryside in general and to wildlands of one sort or another, hoping that we can create a counterforce from this, what we might call third fire, to overcome the flames on open landscapes. Well, the settlement process combining all of this, produced a wave of massive megafires of historic interest throughout the places. The US, Australia, Canada are particularly well documented, but we could add Russia moving into Siberia. And these created an alarm that the combination of land clearing and burning was creating havoc environmentally and threatening communities. And that gave rise to what we might call state-sponsored conservation, the idea that the state would have to intervene to break this deadly cycle. Conservation was really the sustainability project of its time, and it identified fire as the most vivid expression of this havoc, and fire control was fundamental to the project. And this proceeded from the Rocky Mountains of the American West to the Central Hills of India. And it created a management matrix for dealing with landscape fire. It identified as the particular landscapes of interest, reserved and public lands. This was where fire institutions would be invented. The knowledge would come from modern science, which would replace traditional lore and practice. In fact, traditional practice was seen as part of the problem and had to be suppressed as much as their fires. Policy and practice, fire was seen as something that happens sometimes in the year and some years. It's an episodic problem that requires an emergency intervention, not as something that is a continual project. In fact, most fire officers in these institutions did fire part-time. In governance, the appropriate governance mechanism was a state-sponsored forestry bureau, whether within a developing country or whether within a colonial setting. And this was the matrix that we have inherited and now need to transform. And those of you who may be fans of Kipling and the Jungle Book may wonder what happened to Mowgli after he grew up. Kipling wrote a story. It turns out Mowgli joins the Indian Forest Service, and one of whose tasks is to fight jungle fires. The US example, we can see how these two realms of combustion play out. This is a correlation, but I think it can be translated into causality as well. The burned area, as recorded, steadily drops throughout the 20th century. Meanwhile, our fossil fuel emissions are rising. So we see fires in living landscapes declining, the burning of lithic landscapes is rising, and we have a kind of sweet spot, historical period where this seems to work before it no longer does. And this third fire offered not only a counterforce for fire suppression, but it resulted in this changed landscape that fire would operate within. So it's not just that it changed changing climate, but it was changing the way we live on the land, and the fires are integrating those changes. Which leads us to examples like this, highly mechanized firefighting. In fact, if you took all of these machines away, could we even pretend to fight fire? No, it would be nonsense. We would have to do what people have traditionally always done, manage the landscape and substitute our fires for wildfires. After 50 years in the US, often seen as a leader in this process, the blowback was clear, and federal land agencies began changing their policies. So we spent 50 years trying to take all fire out, and we have since spent 50 years trying to put good fire back in. And it turns out it's a lot easier to take it out at first than to put it back in later. And I note that all this happens before climate change was recognized or became an issue. This was all the result of our changing fire practices and how we lived on the land. But now climate change has become more prominent and undeniable. It's acting as a performance enhancer, and it's acting as a globalizer, so that even countries which have not made these changes now experience the consequence. This transformation has also reorganized fire history. What we might regard as first fire for 420 million years or so operated according to its own logic. When humans come in, begin domesticating and reorganizing it, they change the patches and pulses, the mosaic within which fire will operate, and I think greatly expand the domain of fire. But now when we start burning lithic landscapes, fossil fuels, we have to add a historical dimension, a dimension of deep time, because we're taking material out of the geologic past, we're burning it and processing it in various ways in the present, with consequences we don't really understand, and we're releasing that effluent into the geologic future. Along the way, the world is dividing between those that operate in a third nature with its characteristic fires and those which continue to operate within what we might call a second nature and those traditional fires. And no, not all of Europe is dependent on combustion for power, but I think the society itself is clearly within this alternative realm. And one of the things that happens as you make this transition is that second fire gets lost. And the loss of that fire has not only allowed fuels to build up in our landscapes, but has also unhinged the ecology and denied many ecological goods and services that we require. And we might ponder among the many paradoxes of fire why it is that the most developed countries are being hit with the worst fires. This is not a particular pathology that comes from making this transition. So the kind of fires we're seeing today are the result in the developed world of all of these changes in how we live on the land and use or misuse fire. Fire is integrating it. This is what fire does. It's a reaction. It takes its character from its context. And the kinds of fires we see today are the result of all the choices we have made to create this kind of world. And climate history, I would argue, has become a sub-narrative of fire history. It's no longer a question of living with fire. It's now about living with a fire age. The last 2.5 million years, the Pleistocene, climate change, driven by orbital changes and so forth, 80% of it was glacial. In the last million years, 90% has been glacial. That is dominated by ice-informed landscapes, all kinds of peripheral landscapes, including permafrost, lakes, and so forth, drops in sea level, mass extinctions. Oops. And the hominins, a genus that learned to control fire. Here are the erectines doing what hominins did, bringing fuel to fire. But let's pass that through a kind of Pyrrhic looking glass, and we enter the current age, the Pyrrhocene, in which fire-informed biotas are driving out all of the vestiges of the ice ages, not just the ice, but all of the animals and plants that had been characteristic of those times, replacing it with a new biogeography, changes in sea level, mass extinctions, and all the collateral landscapes. So instead of outwashed plains, we may have debris flows after severe fires. And instead of proglacial lakes, perhaps enormous smoke palls and heat domes. And lands, instead of permafrost, what seems to be a perma-thaw. And catalytic high-severity fires that are birthing new biomes. And the hominins, here they are fleeing from the consequences of their fire. This is Fort McMurray in Canada. Fort McMurray, a town established to mine fossil fuels, but in the boreal bush, and the two worlds. Those two realms of fire, burning both ends of our candle, as it were, resulted in disaster. And here we are using our petrol-powered cars to flee. So welcome to an ever-deepening piracy. So how do we understand fire in the piracy? Well, part of it, we need to reimagine fire's environment. What are the landscapes that matter? We're at a conference dedicated to wildland fire, but we're so far beyond wildland fire. That origin, that particular quirky environments that created the fire establishment as we understand it, is wholly inadequate. We need to talk about anthropogenic landscapes. And we need to reconceptualize what a working rural landscape might look like and what fire is appropriate. And let's be candid. All of these wildlands, even legally designated wilderness, are those not cultural creations. They're political acts where people deny certain kinds of human behavior and occupation. So that also is a creation of ours. What about knowledge? Forestry advanced into physical chemistry, especially the study of fire behavior. But more and more, if we're dealing with landscapes, we need to think of fire as a biological phenomenon. No, fire isn't alive, but much like a virus, which isn't alive, it requires the living world to propagate and takes on some of those properties. And we need a science that is adequate to that. We also need to recover traditional knowledge. Much of this is now being discussed in the context of decolonization, but it also applies to the colonizers. Europe has its own traditional knowledge in great quantities, and we need to recover that. The science has been inadequate to meet all of our needs for managing fire, and we need to recover knowledge that had been built over hundreds or thousands of years. And not to be too provocative here, I was struck by these two graphs produced some years ago. One, the upper graph shows the amount of money being spent on fire suppression in the United States, and the bottom one, a graph of science publications. And what was almost creepy is that the two are essentially the same curve. And many of us would look at those suppression dollars and say, yeah, the fires are getting worse, but the more money is not solving the fire problem. But can we not say the same thing about fire science? Yes, we need it, but is that going to be a solution? My interpretation is that technology can enable, but it doesn't advise. And that science can advise, but it doesn't decide. And the decisions, the choices, will be made on cultural values, ultimately synthesized in some political arrangement. I don't think we can resolve the core questions by science alone, because they are fundamentally not scientific questions. In one sense, we need to recover our old practices, but give them a modern form. And that is where science and technology can help. Much as this building, which was, I believe, established in the early 17th century, has now been repurposed and outfitted with new devices. What about policy and practice? It used to be simple. You did one thing, you put out fires. There were simple metrics to measure whether you accomplished it. Now, it's a whole spectrum. What does fire suppression mean? It means protecting towns. It means managing fires in remote settings. It means fires in agricultural settings. What about prescribed burning? That means a whole bunch of things too. It's a whole gamut of choices and managerial mashups. My favorite is the paradox of managed wildfire, which is becoming common in my part of the world, which is part suppression and part prescribed fire done under urgent conditions. So fire is not just an emergency intervention that occurs occasionally, but it's an unending process of ecological management and infrastructure maintenance. And that is a fundamental change in how we think about fire. And what about fire governance? Well, forestry bureaus were organs of colonial rule and economic development, and they too are becoming mixed in management, jurisdictions, and hybrids. The disestablishment of forestry bureaus, their conversion into other things, or their dismissal, as a prominent feature of recent years, and now we deal with multiple government agencies, with a robust civil society, with private associations, including industry. Indigenous and tribal groups want a voice, and there are international bodies. All of these are now in play in ways that were not true before. And it's not just about policies, it's about politics. And we need to reimagine fire's political context. And we in the fire community need to create a new matrix and metrics that is legible to the public and politicians so they understand what the real task of fire is. If we rely on traditional measurements, we will default to traditional responses. So a fire triangle for the pyrocene, 2 examples from California here. We need to protect our communities, our critical assets, our communities, and our ecological treasures. We've lost 15 to 20% of sequoia groves, the world's stock of sequoia groves in the last 5 years. It's unconscionable. 3 of our first 4 national parks were established to protect these groves, and we are failing. And our communities, this is the town of Paradise, California, which lost 85, but note the disparity between the forest, which is adapted and came through fine, and the town, which was not adapted and was incinerated. We need to reinstate good fire, the appropriate fire, in our rural and countryside settings and even into wildlands. And this will be a long-term project. I like this photo because in one hand, he has a firefighting tool, and in the other, a drip torch. And that is the kind of mashup we will have. And I will note, too, that the drip torch is running fossil fuels. And thirdly, we need to tame climate change. This is the Hazelwood power plant that burned coal from an open pit mine. This is in Victoria, Australia. Power lines from the power plant were responsible for, by far, the most of fatalities in the 2009 fires in Australia. Several years later, the open pit mine caught fire. And so we have this terrifying recursive loop now of positive feedback. The plant has since been closed. But we need to do all 3 of these at the same time. We can't wait for climate change to be controlled to begin mitigation, but if we only do mitigation, climate change will eventually override our efforts. And I would like to point out that even if we substitute renewables for fossil fuels, but we live on the land the same way, we just have a different power source, we will continue to have the same fire problems. We have a lot of fire in our future. And those of us who are here today, each in our own small way, have a contribution to what may be the great narrative of our time, reestablishing an appropriate relationship with fire. Well, as we move into that future, what awaits us? I'm often reminded of the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel, who warned, "They shall go out from one fire, and another fire shall devour them." Well, that does seem to be an apt description of what we're doing, but I would suggest that it's actually worse than that, because we're not dealing with 2 fires, we're dealing with 3. And like any 3-body problem, there is no exact solution. But I would also remind us that we are the Earth's keystone species for fire. Fire is what we do that no other creature does. It's our role in the great chain of being, and it is within our capabilities to choose wisely and to act. Good fire made us, bad fire may break us, but that choice is very much up to us. And with that, I'll thank you for your time and attention.
The book Pyrocene of Mr. Stephen Pine is available for sale at the lobby near the registration.
Branding.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I understand it's also been translated into Italian, so we're gradually spreading the word out there. Thank you very much, Stephen. I think it's very provocative, very interesting. I particularly like the idea of science and technology enabling providing advice and a decision, but that's a political process. I also like the third age of fire. I love fire, and I'm glad I'm in the third age of fire, but I'm also incredibly frightened about being in the third age of fire. Perhaps, Herafidi, if I can ask you to tell us a little bit about the fire problem in Madagascar.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Pete. To come back to the case of Madagascar, the problem is almost the same that we have in the presentation by Steve. But to stress more about it, there is this question of having more fires today, and where is the angle on which we are going to address these fires? Because, in several countries, in Madagascar, but also in the northern countries, we clearly see that we have more fire frequencies and fire intensities that we are facing. And we are facing it even there is, let's say, some other context specific. For example, in Madagascar, it has a very, very limited country specific where we still have a lot of slash and burn activities linked to the agriculture situations, and where, there is this question of second nature of fire or third nature of fire, where fire is still used for agriculture. So the question is, are we thinking about fire as a tool or as a problem? Because most of the time, fire is used as a tool, and it has been used as a tool everywhere in the world for management. And as shown in the presentation, it is used for managing the landscape. So for ourselves, the problem is more, how we manage the landscapes rather than how we manage the fire. So the question here is not really about fire. It is more about how people manage their landscape. So the question has to be recentered, in human being and the knowledge and how we use this knowledge. So to go further on that, most of the time we are thinking about, I'm a forester, so I'm thinking about how to have, these beautiful forests where you have a lot of biomass everywhere. But when you have a lot of forests, you have higher risk of fire. So there is this paradox on how we can manage, in between the, let's say, the priorities on ecology and also the priorities on how we can think about territorial planning in the future. So the point here is we can do some assessment here inside the room, and I'm pretty sure that more than 80% of us are from the ecology part. I mean, forester like me and so on. But it is clear that in the future we will need more people from the social dimensions of fire and also from the economic part of the, let's say, the socio-economic dimensions of fire, and how we can work together in the future. And I think that this session is key about, let's say, thinking on how we have in this framework a balance in between socio-economic sciences and also the ecological part, of course, on thinking on the future of managing, let's say, more resilient landscapes.
Thank you very much. I think it's very interesting that you've managed to bring together the fact that it's a tool, not a problem, that it needs to be managed. I think the point about social need is incredibly large. I think we have had a very strong technical approach to solving or working on this problem over the decades. Certainly the whole time I've been working in fire management until the last decade, it was all about technology. Alexander, Stephen mentioned about politics. You're a member of the parliament here in Portugal and have had a significant role and do have in the science and education. Do you have any reflections on the problem?
Well, thank you. Thank you for for the question. I'd like to start off by saying that when I was invited to come here today, I decided I needed to read your book. And so I spent the last 4 weeks reading the, not every hour of every day, but I spent the last 4 weeks reading the book in translation in Portuguese. I probably would have preferred to read it in English, but it was an eye-opener for me, so I'd like to thank you for that. The second point I'd like to make is I think the reason I was invited to be here with you is because of my quote-unquote multidisciplinary background and the fact that we now know that many of the complex problems that we are facing require a multidisciplinary approach. And that is always very difficult because each area of knowledge has its own language, and some people try to make it almost incomprehensible to others just to show that they are very knowledgeable. And so dialogue between different areas of knowledge is not always very easy. I started as a theoretical physicist. I was born in Mozambique, so I have my soul is an African soul. I lived in Southern Africa for about 25 years. I spent the next 25 years in Berkeley in California, and then the last 30 years in Portugal. And I started from physics, moved to physiology, was interested in oxidative stress. I was very glad you mentioned the importance of oxygen for fire, because we also consume oxygen. And I always say that when you do too much exercise, maybe you're aging faster because you're oxidizing a little faster. That's just a provocation. And now I'm a member of parliament. And so I have two issues that I would like to raise with you. The first one doesn't have so much to do with policies. The second one does. The first one is I get this feeling that the Pyrocene is inevitable. In other words, the inevitability of moving into an age that we would like to call the Pyrocene, with all the analogies that you make to the previous ages that the Earth has gone through. I think it was very important for us to get a historical perspective of the Earth's evolution. And so the idea of the irreversibility of the Pyrocene is something that I would like to hear you talk a little bit more about, and whether what we are really doing and need to do is just adapt to this change. Do we have to have policies of adaptation to the Pyrocene? Because that's very different from trying to evade it or not move as fast into it. And I think that's a question that fascinates me, and I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about it. Because in the old days, I remember people talking about the nuclear winter. If you have too much smoke, then what you will end up is with another ice age. And so I'm a little, I find this a very provocative area, and I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that. And the second one has more to do with the question of policy. How do you convert knowledge into policy? And most people, and one of the things I've learned by being in Parliament for the last half a dozen years is that people don't realize that knowledge takes a long time. It takes a very long time to understand and to answer a question, even a simple question. Sometimes the simple questions are the most difficult ones to answer, and it takes a very long time. And politicians usually don't have the luxury of time. They are forced to make decisions and to introduce policies without having all the information that would be useful. And we have some amazing examples, good examples and bad examples of this exercise. Very few people today talk about acid rain. It hasn't disappeared, but we don't talk about it very much. We don't talk about the ozone hole, which hasn't disappeared either, but we don't talk about it. The issues surrounding lead poisoning, which was used in gasoline, which was used in paints for children's toys. We don't talk about that anymore. We don't talk about mercury and cadmium poisoning very much, even though it's still there. So certain policies were adapted that helped it to deal with some of these things. And I like to call these the good examples. The bad example is that we've had 30 conference of parts. 30. The next, 29. We're going to have the next one, 30. And today, after 30 years, CO2 is increasing at 3 times the rate it was increasing 30 years ago. And we've known this for 60 years. For 70 years, we've known that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, or more even, 100 years. And yet, things don't seem to be changing that much. It's very slow. And if you go into public health, you have the same issue. You have the immense success of vaccines, which changed the way people live. And yet you had this guy with the orange hair that was in the White House for a few years, and he recommended that we inject ourselves with toxic stuff, whatever it was. And we still have, in the United States, a very large number of people that have not been vaccinated. So we have these interesting, good and bad examples. How do we learn from the good examples to be able to deal with some of these questions? And I would stop right here. And thank you for your talk.
Oh, thank you very much, Alexander. In fact, I remind you again that on your app, you can provide questions, and we've got one from the crowd that actually talks to the point that Alexander just made, which is, have we been able to manipulate the environment sufficiently to cause this issue, and can we move it back again? The fire issue.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part.
We've been so influential in moving to the Pyrocene age. Do we have the capacity to move it back again?
Well, I think we have the capacity if we choose. I mean, it's a priority. Does it matter, or how much does it matter? At what cost? I think we also should be prepared, even though we offer hope. I mean, I've got children, I've got grandchildren. I'm not very happy with the world they're going to inherit. I want them to be able to thrive in that world. But at the same time, I was struck by visiting on a field trip on a fire conference. We went to an area that had been severely burned and would not recover in its former. And everybody was lamenting this, as they should, because we remember what it was like before. And in a sense, you expand that over the globe. But I was thinking, if my grandkids were here, what would they see? They would not see the loss. They would simply see it as it is. And that would become a metric for them. So this is not a counsel of despair, but it's a sense of realism. We need to give them the chance to respond to the world that they have, not just deal with the world that apparently has been lost. I'm not sure I answered your question, but
No.
we created this problem. We can't go back to the way it was, but we can begin modulating it and moving in a better direction.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, that we're not, we perhaps might, in a romantic way, like to think we can go back to where we were, but that's a highly unlikely and improbable outcome. What we can do is move to a more informed and managed and arranged system that suits better the circumstances that we have at the moment. There's a number of questions that are coming in. A couple about at the individual level, which I might leave to the end, not about us as individuals, about all of you as individuals and everybody as individuals. If we talk about, one question that came in, Alexander, was about, do you think that politicians are sufficiently, well, not sufficiently, I'm qualifying it, are aware of the size of the problem? Yeah.
You know, politicians are not very different from ordinary people, although you may think so. But some of them are aware, and some of them are not aware. But I think sometimes the other component that comes into this picture, if we want to construct a narrative, is that there is a lot of fake information that is also coming out all the time. There's a lot of, and even in the scientific community, sometimes there's not consensus about certain issues, which is normal. That's what science is all about. Knowledge is about asking questions, imagining answers, and then testing those answers. That's what knowledge is about, whether it's in history or in physics or in whatever subject. And so when there's a little bit of controversy about something, the media also have a very important role, because if it's not, you know, I read a few years ago that 94% of what Americans read, listen to, or watch, 94% is in the hands of 6 big industries. And so you hear and you listen to and you are submitted to information that is controlled and regulated. And so when there is controversy, media love controversy. That's the way you sell. You know, I'm a great admirer of the importance of the media, but this is a fact. And so, and politicians, when they're not very knowledgeable about a certain subject, become unsure, insecure about whether to move forward. And it comes back to the issue I brought, which is time. Sometimes they are not given time to be able to understand things. But I think it's also a problem of continuous education, making them realize that this is an issue and bringing to them the most robust knowledge that exists about a certain field. And it's in distinguishing the robust from the fragile knowledge that I think we need to also make an effort. Us as a society, as a group of people, we need to also educate people to educate is the wrong word, but help them understand where they can go for knowledge that is robust and to question knowledge that seems fragile. It's not easy to do. It takes time.
No, I think that's definitely very true. Afidi, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to add on that, I think for our case in Madagascar, but also in Africa, most of the time the politicians are aware of the problem. But it is a question of how we present the problem to the politicians, you know, because most of the time we are presenting the problem of fires like an emergency problem, you know. For example, in our country, the financing for fire comes after fire. When we have fires, we have a lot of money of preventing fires, but it is too late. It is the reason why I'm saying how we present the problem to the politicians. It is not an emergency problem, it is a problem of managing the landscape. So we have to have, you know, this financing early than when we will have the problem. So I think it is key to think about how we can address the problem in this angle. And, you know, if we are discussing inside the room about who has enough finance for his work, nobody would say yes. We have a lot of problems of, let's say, scarce financing for firefighting, scarce financing for fire prevention, etc., etc. And if we would wait when we will have enough finance, everything will be burnt. So it is a question of, you know, what we say value for money. It was in the presentation on where we have to put the money at the right activity. So it is, you know, the cost of the answer. So in my point of view, we have to rethink about where, you know, we have to put €1 and where it will be efficient for all of the actions that we have in terms of prevention, in terms of firefighting, and in terms of restoration post-fire. So there is something to think about the balance in between.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, did you want to say?
If I could intervene, I think the question, I have told the story from a fire perspective because I like to do that. I'm a pyromantic at heart, not a pyromaniac, important distinction. But fire is a great interactive phenomenon in technology. And we think about addressing the fire problem, we don't need trillions of dollars to something called fire. Because many of the things we need to do anyway. And fire can be a part of that, should be a part of that. It's not a separate project. And so I think that can reduce some of the cost and the difficulty of identifying it. It is just part of all kinds of other stuff we're doing.
Yeah, certainly.
But isn't it true that, in fact, many issues become relevant in society when they happen, when they occur? And the idea of, and again, we have some very good examples. You know, we vaccinate children when they are born because this is an intelligent thing to do. And so the lifespan of people today is twice what it was 100 years ago because we invested in public health. It's not perfect, but we have done that. So it is possible to do. Why don't we do we think it's because humans are more important than the rest of the environment? This is we do think that. Many people do think that, unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, we're certainly acting that way.
That's right.
The rest of the world may disagree and rise up in rebellion.
So there's a question that's come in from the floor, which is along that line, which is about, we've got lots of fire managers and lots of technicians and lots of researchers and lots of people in that. And I think Afidi mentioned, 90% of us are in that sort of zone, and we need more in the social zone. But the question that's come in is, what are the sort of changes at the political level? Now, we have a politician, so I won't ask you the question first. But Afidi, what do you think we could change, at the political level? Like you're in Madagascar, what sort of things would you like to see change that could help it work through? Apart from some of the thinking type things that we've been talking about.
I think the change that we are hoping is, having, as described earlier, most of the time we are talking about, let's say, we are talking the same languages, but we don't understand each other. So, I think it is key to have interface in between policymakers and science first, and having also an interface in between policy, science, and local communities. Because at the end of the day, science, as described by Steve, it will be more for advice. The politicians will decide, but the implementations will be done by NGOs and local communities. So we have to have an idea of how we create together a bridge in between and how we can facilitate that. And I hope that the framework that we are creating here will have this, let's say, create this interface on, let's say, having a shared vision of facing the problem.
Okay.
I think we're getting towards the end. I'd like to maybe mention two or three examples, 2 or 3 success stories that have to do with Portugal. I mentioned already how we dealt with the last pandemic, and I think what the government decided to do over a fairly extended period of time was to have public meetings that were shown on television of groups of scientists, groups of parliamentarians, the Prime Minister, the President of the Republic, the President of Parliament, where they would, every week, they would look at the data that were coming out from the pandemic, and they would discuss what that meant. And more importantly, they discussed also what they still didn't know, what they still was the question marks. And I think this exercise over a period of several months, helped to create the trust that is necessary for things to change. A lot of people criticized and said, oh, here, they're showing off. Then now the prime minister's coming and the president of the republic. But slowly, as you listen to some of the people that were knowledgeable, and you realize that they still didn't know all that needed to know was very important. You have to create trust. That's one example. Another one is Portugal several years ago developed a drug policy, which is now considered to be one of the most advanced drug policies in the world. I still have journalists from Australia and Canada asking, what was this that you did with the drug policy? And again, it was putting together people that knew about what the problem was and knew what the fragility of different things were and put things together. And just to end, just to say, our minister was here with you this morning, and I think you probably got an idea of to what extent how ambitious the climate law is. We were able to put together a law that was approved by 96% of parliamentarians, which is not, it's not easy, or 95 or 93, it doesn't matter. It was very hard support. And that was because we also helped dialogue between people. You can't have everything you want. And of course, some people thought we didn't go far enough. Some people thought we went too far. And the balance is difficult to equate. But I think these stories of success need to be further popularized. They need to be known. Things that work, you need to talk about them. And most of the things in the media are usually about things that don't work.
Yes.
That sells more than the things that do work. And perhaps we need to make an effort to talk more about the success stories that we have to tell.
That's true, and there's certainly many of those in the fire management frame. Techniques and tactics at work, communities that have been supported and encouraged to develop it, and ecosystems that have been restored or understood, but not at large scale, unfortunately, it seems. Stephen, somebody's asking about how we get politicians and firefighters to work together. I know you study fires as a sort of entity unto itself, but what thoughts do you have on getting the two ends together?
I don't know. Part of the problem is that while we identify this as a fire problem, in many ways fire is a symptom rather than the problem itself.
Yes.
So it may not be in the capability of the fire agencies themselves to deal with. It is a much larger issue. So we certainly need to understand how people on the ground actually doing things, how they see their issues and understand it, but it may not be within their capacity to fix it, even if you expand that capacity. For example, and in many ways it is a problem. Why is this a fire problem? We had a term that was created about 40 years ago in California called wildland-urban interface fire. It's a stupid term, we're stuck with it. But it dealt with the issue of fires affecting communities that were abutting public lands and so forth. And it was defined by the wildland fire community, which saw their management complicated by all these houses. And that turns out to be a very difficult problem to deal with. But we could have picked up the other end of the stick. Wildland, urban, let's look at it as an urban fire problem. This is a problem of how we build our cities, and it's urban fire with peculiar landscaping. If you define it that way, the solution is very clear. If you define it as a wildland fire problem, it's very complicated and murky. So we need to be careful in defining this as a fire problem. In what way is it really a fire problem that addressing fire, directly confronting fire, which usually means either lighting it or attacking it, solves it, or is it another problem and fire is a symptom of that?
Okay. A question that's come in and that I think is probably valid. Did you want to say something, Alexander?
No, I think one of the things that I really appreciated about what you said in your book and in your talk is the fact that it seems that traditional knowledge is being, I'm not sure what the word is, recuperated or, and is being brought back to policies in the United States. Mm-hmm. This is actually happening. So that is a success story. Maybe you'd like it more. You'd like for more to be the fact. But I think these are amazing stories that, in fact, the people who trained to believe that it's the most advanced technologies that are going to solve problems, maybe if they look back and look at some of the solutions that were there before, could help in the problem. And I find that very, very inspiring, in a word. You know, maybe that's part of the message we need to put out, that there's things we shouldn't neglect that have accumulated knowledge over centuries that I find, and where there are success stories to be told about it.
There are success stories. We're trying to reintroduce good fire, prescribed fire. This is a commitment at almost all levels of the fire community in the United States, even at agency levels, and we have been unable to do it at scale. And it clearly because of the way we have defined how to reintroduce fire. And yet, people 100 years ago did it as a matter of course. Yeah. Fire was simple and was part of normal maintenance of how you manage your land. And we can learn, how is it that they did it? Well, they did it a very different way than we do. Mm-hmm. And we can modernize that, but we need to model on those kinds of practices, which were much less specific. Yeah. And we can do it. If we insist on doing it in a completely prescribed and controlled ways, we fall behind every year. Mm-hmm. And then the only fires we're getting our burned area is by wildfire, some of which is doing some good, a lot of what is doing is making a mess, yeah. But I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I think the other thing you're saying is that just by throwing money at a problem, it's not necessarily the only thing that's going to solve it. No. That sometimes you need to sort of step back, you need time.
We do, yeah. Definitely. I did a lot of oral history in my PhD, and it was amazing what you find out when you talk to people who have long memories. Just a sort of a final question for the three of you. This is an international conference. We're looking at an international framework, a global framework. Do you think the problems we're talking about can be successfully approached by having an international global framework and tapping into, say, the experience of Madagascar that Harifidi's talking about, some of the things that you're talking about, the successes that we just mentioned? Maybe if I can start with Harifidi, please.
I think yes. The reason is, I think it is not a question of the framework, but how we apply the framework. In terms of, we are all here this week, and I think that we are still facing, and in the presentation it is clear that we would have more fires in the future. And I think that if we are coming back from here and we are doing everything as a business as usual, the framework and the Congress will be a failure. If we are coming out of the conference and with the framework, and we are going to do something separate in a different way than when we come here, I think that it will be successful. So for that, there is two key points. The first one is how we have the enough humility to learn each other. So having the learning part inside the framework on how we really can have some new ideas, innovations for the future based on landscape management and resilient landscape in the future. I think it is key. And the second point is more how it can consider all of the contexts that we have, because the context of the US is not the context in Australia, it is not the context in Africa. So how this framework can be context-specific and consider all of this with the dimensions of social part, economic part, and the human being part.
Okay, so humility and context, I like both of those actually. Alexander?
It's not an easy question to answer. I think the diversity of ecosystems in the world and political systems in the world and the levels of economic stability or instability are such that it's very difficult to have a solution. But I think gatherings such as this one are important because you share between yourselves stories that are worth sharing and knowledge that has been acquired. Sharing stories that have been successful so that others don't have to make the same mistakes again, that could learn from it. Not all stories can be adapted to any environmental system, but some can. And I think that's why meetings such as these are extremely important, because they are the ones that propagate the knowledge that has been acquired and hopefully make those who have to make decisions more sensitive to the information that is developing.
Stephen?
Wow, difficult question. Often I'm approached by people in the fire community. They want to know, what can we learn from history so we don't repeat mistakes, or what can we learn from the past? And many times they want to know techniques or technology.
Yeah.
And there are cases where that works. We can learn from traditional knowledge, for example, and adapt it. And there are many cases where they want to transfer science or knowledge. But I think ultimately what we learn from is how people made choices in their own time, how they had to live in a world about which they had incomplete knowledge. And they made choices that may have seemed reasonable at the time, maybe not. And then how did they deal with the choice if it was clear that it was wrong? So they're not specifics you can learn from here, but you can learn, how do you behave? It's sort of a character study. We've had examples, I can think of many countries, even in the US, where we've decided fire is a big issue. We're going to put a lot of money into it, and we did, and it was misdirected. And it took us another 40 years to reverse that. But in the meantime, the landscape bears the scars of those choices. Why couldn't we have done this in a way that we could self-correct easier? So that, I think, is ultimately what people from my field can contribute to it. That, and I think narratives. And I don't mean just stories of success, but I think some larger narrative about, what does this mean? How can we understand it? And I think we were chatting earlier, and I said, I know we'll have achieved success when Hollywood produces an action film based on prescribed burning, which I don't expect to happen. But this is the contribution we need to make too. We have great stories. We have great narratives of firefighting. And in many cases, we need firefighting. But it is not all the story. And we need comparable narratives, not just stories and examples, but we need grand narratives, gripping narratives that can inspire people about why restoring fire is important.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. I think did you want to say something, Alexander? Or no? I think that there's some very good points to finish on. I really like Arquivo mentioning humility. There's lots of knowledge and in lots of places, in lots of people, in lots of different forms. And I think being quiet and listening to what people are saying and trying to understand where they're coming from is important. And Arquivo mentioned context. I particularly like, Alexander, you talked about the process in Portugal of the Parliament and the President and the Prime Minister coming together over an extended period of time. So gradually the energy drops out of the room and things come together. I think that's another process that we should all look at very carefully. And then Stephen, of course, telling us about the idea of what we need to do and how we need to think of it. And particularly that fire is a major symptom of what we have, and that we need to think about it in other ways, in other approaches, and work on collectively. That's the end of our time. I'd like to ask all of you to join me in thanking our panellists, Arquivo, Alexander and Stephen for the presentation. Thank you very much.